had the guns elevated on a platform above the wall, and so you can bore sight and you just look through the barrel at what you're trying to hit, and you're firing line of sight. So it's just like a very big rifle at that stage. We were taking IED strikes when we did try to go out within 30 metres of the wall. So people would crawl up under the cover of dust storms and lay IEDs basically under our watch positions. When you come back from that absolute heightened intensity where every sensor in your body is alert, it feels like you've been staring at the sun, and you come back to normal life and everything is just a sort of pale imitation of the real deal. I spoke to Fee maybe once a fortnight, once every 3 weeks, because it felt like that was there and I'm here. And the more I am in that world, the less I am focused on this world. And this world is survival.
Hello everyone, this is Maz. So today I'm releasing a conversation with a good friend of mine, Robert Hartley. Given the topic of this discussion and its potential importance to many veterans and their families, I'm releasing the full episode on the public channel. As you will hear, Rob goes into much detail about his combat experience while serving in Helmand Province in Afghanistan back in 2010. Rob, who was at the time a junior Australian artillery officer, was on exchange with the British Army and spent 7 months defending a small outpost against hardened insurgents. This is a deeply personal, honest, and hard-hitting discussion, but it is also a story of perseverance, hope, and a steady journey to recovery. Some of the topics we covered are Rob's rotation into theatre, the thrill of preparing for and going to war, the use of artillery as direct fire weapons, a description of Helmand as the kinetic province, a reflection on how the local population might have viewed him and other coalition forces, dealing with multiple casualties, reflecting on mateship, camaraderie and a sense of purpose, the process of desensitization to war and combat, reflection on the burden of command, the challenge of preserving one's own moral compass, and the struggle of upholding the delicate facade of morality in battle, the price of extreme compartmentalization and rationalization, returning home, signs that things weren't right and asking for help, symptoms, PTSD diagnosis, and importance of command support, short-term fixes but eventual relapse, downward spiral, and continual emotional compartmentalization, the path to recovery and reconnecting to emotions, joining Dr Alex Lim's Ketamine trial, onboarding and treatment initiation, a reflection on the ketamine treatment, its sensations, experiences and insights, a discussion on why ketamine remains contentious, how his treatment affected Rob's relationships with his wife and children, why seeking help matters, and other topics. Finally, given the nature of this discussion and the fact that many in our audience are veterans, there's a risk that elements of this episode might be difficult listening for some. If this is the case, I encourage you to seek help through one of the many channels nowadays available, some of which I've shared in the show notes. Okay, now let's get to my chat with Robert Hartley. My guest today is Robert Hartley, who is a former Australian Army officer who served for 12 years in the Artillery Corps before transitioning to a civilian career in the technology sector. During his time in the military, Robert deployed on exchange with the British Army on Operation Herrick XII to Helmand Province, Afghanistan in 2010. In his civilian life, Robert has worked for a number of technology companies, including Microsoft, before joining a startup where he is an executive director. Robert joins me today to discuss his life in the Army, how his deployment to Helmand resulted in a PTSD diagnosis, as well as his journey to recovery, which includes being part of the ketamine trials that I discussed at length with Dr Alex Lim a few episodes ago. Lastly, for full disclosure, Rob is a good friend of mine. We completed all of our initial officer training together, and although we haven't always kept in touch throughout the years, I've always been well aware of Rob's outstanding achievements, both in uniform and as a civilian. On that note, Rob, it's a true pleasure to host you on The Voice of War. Thanks for agreeing to join me.
No, thank you, Maz. It's great to be here, and you're too kind.
It's true, mate. You've certainly set the standard, both in service in uniform, but also outside. And I've certainly enjoyed watching how your career's progressed. Not many of our friends have landed so well on the outside, in the outside world. On that note, also, you're the second person or second a good friend of mine who I'm speaking with on this dire topic. So right at the kind of start of the podcast, I spoke with Ash Judd, who, as you fully well know, he became somewhat of a face for the kind of increasing awareness of PTSD in the Army. So I genuinely mean it. Thank you for joining me. I know it's a very deeply personal subject, and I'm humbled that you've agreed. So thanks again.
No, not a problem at all. No, your episode with Ash was one of the first ones that I listened to. That's what set me down the Voices of War journey.
Okay, well, glad to hear it. I mean, it's that was back in the early days, I suppose. So before we get to the, I guess, rather dark subject of PTSD, firstly, maybe what motivated you to join the Army? What led to that? Have you got military in the family, or how did that occur?
No, look, honestly, I think it was almost accidental for me. My grandfather, was in the military, as almost everyone of that generation was around World War II. So he was Kingston Scottish Borderers, a European background, and fought across World War II. But I wouldn't say it was we're not one of those families with a strong military history where everyone talks about it, thinks about it. And for me, it was after year 12, I had a gap year. Really didn't know what I wanted to do with myself, and I was just looking around at options. And at a career fair, I ran into some Army recruiters, and it was almost the accidental. It was a great process of come to one thing to find out a bit more information, and then just you pass this round, just come to another day and learn a bit more, and do one more round of testing, and sort of before you know it, I was down that path, and accepted into ADFA for university, and it all went from there. But it definitely wasn't. I wasn't one of those people that grew up dreaming of joining the military. Yeah,
right. And why artillery? What led that? Was there a reason that you opted for artillery?
Look, in brutal honesty, there's probably two parts of it. As you would well know, I wasn't the finest staff cadet going around. I think I was always a bit of a struggler in barracks, so I never rated too highly. And some of the corps that were very competitive to get into. I think
that's because you had a spirit. I don't think that was anything to do with your performance. I think because you were always rather spirited.
I was maybe a bit of a larrikin, quite a few extra check grades, but I wanted to go to an arms corps, and infantry, armoured were very competitive, and dream of I was sold the dream of forward observer in artillery. That really appealed to me. And then there was also, it was a far less competitive, so I thought I've got a much better opportunity of getting that pick and getting my preference of where I wanted to go, which was I'm working with the parachute battalion out of Sydney. So that was sort of the journey. At the time, I imagined it was going to be the forward observer and aircraft and all that great stuff. I never imagined I'd spend so much time on the gun line or love it so much.
And it really almost got to that point anyway for you. I think we'll touch on that. But yes, you spent a lot of time on the gun line, which is, I think, incidentally also how you then deployed to Helmand with the Brits. Can you just describe what happened there? How was it that you, a very junior Australian officer, deployed with the Brits?
Yeah, it was a really interesting process. And when our era, you'd be well aware, Maz, it was sort of coming out of this Timor, Solomon Islands, where artillery had primarily re-rolled into civil military cooperation or re-roll as infantry. And there'd been almost no deployments of artillery in a core role, which I think was why artillery at the time was a little bit on the nose. People thought you're just going to re-roll as someone else, or you're going to go stand on a checkpoint somewhere. So as Iraq and Afghanistan really emerged, the forward observers were readily deployed, but the gun line was never deploying anywhere. And Australia had not, and still has not, to my awareness, deployed its own guns in an offensive capability. So an agreement was struck with the British Army under a unilateral exchange. They were absolutely flooded. They'd taken over a large area of Helmand Province under their command, and they were just running out of gun troop rotations. A lot of the soldiers were coming back from one deployment, posting to a new unit and going immediately again, or even at a brigade-sized deployment, unable to fill their own staffing, so calling in reinforcements from other units who had themselves just come back from another deployment. So I don't know who the brains behind it was, but someone said, well, hey, we've got Australian gunners with a great wealth of technical knowledge. but no opportunity to deploy operationally in their core role. And the British were screaming out for people. So the rotation process was essentially one troop of Australian gunners. So, one junior officer, a couple of senior NCOs, and a troop of a couple of guns worth of Australian gunners picked up, embedded with a British unit for around 14 months all up. It was about 7 months of pre-deployment training, immersing with the British in the UK somewhere, and then 7 months on their Herrick rotation somewhere in Helmand Province with them. I was, I say, lucky enough. I was reflecting on it this morning, and it was a competitive process. Everyone wanted to go. It was the trip of trips, and I think back to even at that early stage, there was some of that recognized stupidity of knowing what am I doing. I used to think back to uni. We learned some of those. We'd look at marketing campaigns around World War I and World War II. Get off the beaches and get into the trenches, and you could expose that as the gamification of the concept of war. Some of the great literature of the past that's really been about that disillusionment of realizing that it isn't a game. So there was a part of my consciousness that was aware I was throwing myself down that same path. But at the same time, there's nothing anyone could have ever said that stopped me wanting to be challenged, wanting to go and see if I could do it, wanting to see if I had it. So we ran almost the unit I was in, the 4 Regiment, ran probably almost, in hindsight, it was probably almost a year-long sort of selection between the junior officers of. It was well known you had to be the best and the most ready to be picked to take that trip over. So it was pretty.
But it was
cool.
also representational posting in many ways. Well, it was very representational in many ways, right?
So I think there was needed the right mix of the right personality, right place, right time, right seniority, performing well on the right technical courses. Didn't do something too stupid and get yourself charged at a mess night for doing something too crazy. So that was from pretty much when I graduated. I worked out that a rotation would be coming up. I was the fifth and penultimate rotation for Herrick. One after me, which was Dan Fussell. They then scrapped the Herrick rotations.
Yeah, and okay. And why did they scrap it?
Not entirely sure. Again, I imagine at a higher level that I wasn't aware of. There was probably some memorandum of understanding that had a certain number of, but at the same time, it was also coming into that drawdown of Australian presence and trying to move to another sort of phase of war. And I think the reality was Helmand Province and the British military were in an entirely different kinetic level of operation. It was not stability; it was counterinsurgency. It was warfare. And I think that we got lucky. No Australian soldiers were killed on those rotations, but it felt like it was a matter of time. And I think it would have been a much harder political justification for. There was no mentoring. There was no hearts and minds growing capability of the Afghan National Army. It was just deploying in your core role and fighting. So I think from an Australian political perspective, when you're trying to wind down your presence in country, you're really promoting that we're there to support and enable. Having some random people off in a kinetic province on the gun line fighting, if one of us, them were to be killed, pretty hard pill to swallow for the Australian public, I think.
For many people, it will be perhaps unclear why somebody on a gun line, given the ranges we're talking about that you're deploying these guns at, and perhaps that's a question to ask as well, is sort of what ranges were you hitting, and then the perhaps natural question that comes from that: why would you have been a threat? Why would your life have been a threat, given that you're presumably quite far from the actual front line?
Yeah. Look, well, the first part of it, I guess I'd say there was no real front line. In the area of Helmand Province that I was in, the fighting was fiercest along the green zone, and that's the few kilometres either side of the Helmand River. And you had, sort of outposts, whether you call them combat outposts, fire support bases, FOBs, forward operating bases, whatever people referred to them as, dotted along at increments between the large populations. and you were positioned so that you could provide offensive support, so 2 patrols in that area, and you were relatively close to each other so you could overlap. The guns that we were using, a British howitzer, had a maximum range of about 18 kilometres. But, I'll pretty say, and we did fire a few missions out at that distance. I remember there was one time an American convoy out in the desert were contacted and needed support right at the edge of the range. But for the last 3 months of our tour, and I remember just reflecting on how idiotic it was, we didn't fire a single mission that wasn't in protection of our own position. So we weren't actually doing our core role of firing in support of patrols. We were only firing in support of our own base. So by virtue of the fact it's this chicken and egg of you're there to provide support, but because you're there, just sitting on the edge of the green zone, you're a target. So it's this, in terms of, counterinsurgency doctrine and it's idiocy. We were fighting because we were there, and they were fighting us because we were there. And we were killing them because they were trying to kill us. And you sort of reflect and go, well, that is just the definition of attrition. We weren't there for the land. We weren't trying to patrol. We didn't have freedom of maneuver or any of those things that you learn about. It was just we were holding ground and they were trying to take it off us. So what I was blown away by was the proximity of it all. So we were high up on a cliff just above the green zone. So we actually used direct fire far more than we use any indirect. For the sort of non-artillery listeners, your indirect fire is where your typical, the guns are at a sort of 45-degree angle and you're lobbing your rounds off 10 kilometres into the distance. Direct fire is where we had the guns elevated on a platform above the wall, and so you can bore sight and you just look through the barrel at what you're trying to hit and you're firing line of sight. So it's just like a very big rifle at that stage. Because all the patrols up to sort of company strength patrols weren't getting out more than about 800 metres from base at any time during the 7-month tour before they were contacted, took a casualty. So it's sort of, you had that intimacy of, even in an artillery role, you are in fire support range. We were the machine gun fire support. We had our 50 cals grenade machine guns. We had even our howitzers were just like really big rifles firing either smoke barrages to help people withdraw, firing direct fire artillery, illumination rounds. And I think that, the tipping point, we had a pretty quiet first part of the tour, kind of normal, I guess you'd call it. But at that stage, we had several hundred, it's quite a large base, probably about 300 people total, Danish mechanised combat team with a couple of Abrams tanks, CV9s, which were an infantry fighting vehicle with, 35mm cannons on them. Like, we were like a bristling porcupine of death. No one wanted to touch us. And then the way things happen with higher headquarters not communicating, the Danish largely got redeployed because we were a quiet area. And it was, again, that cause and effect of it was probably quiet because no one wanted to attack the 300 people with tanks. Take the 300 people and the tanks away, and we were suddenly a very large, very easy target. So our manning fell to about 75 people for the last 3 months of the tour. And it became me and another Danish lieutenant. Sort of he controlled the infantry team, and I controlled the base and the local defence. And at that stage, we became a very obvious target for the local insurgents. And a very helpful Special Forces brethren had prosecuted a few VIPs and killed the local insurgent leader, which kicked off almost an election campaign where there were the 3 rival leaders from different parts of the area, and they all made a campaign promise. And one was going to shoot down an Apache. One was going to, I can't remember what the guy on the other side of the river was going to do, but the guy nearest to us was going to overrun our base. And so he made that his commitment. He was I'm going to overrun that base and I'm going to take it over. And that's sort of how he would become the head honcho. So for about the last 3 months, we were under sustained attack. And we were just fighting to hold the ground that we were there for.
Wow. That's, I imagine for most of our Australian listeners, that might be a surprise to hear that Australians were even involved in that type of fighting in Afghanistan, because most of those Australians who deployed went to TK, Kandahar, Kabul, where things were certainly vastly different. What was it about Helmand? And Helmand obviously is quite renowned for the violence, or as you described it, I think, the kinetic province. What was it about Helmand, you believe, that made it so kinetic?
And I'm far from an expert on this, so it was sort of first-hand observations plus reading I did before I went over, and, your theatre briefs and things like that. And I also will caveat it by saying I just don't have experience of other provinces, so I don't know how different it was. Look, it was really agrarian peasantry. It was, you would watch people farm their fields with sickles by day, no running water apart from what they could do via aqueducts, very little in the way of machinery, maybe one tractor between multiple families in an area, mud hut. So I think you've got that natural, incredibly low socioeconomic grounds where an insurgency can often take root. We're not talking Lashkar where you've previously had universities and you've got quite, you've got one of the interpreters that I worked with, he'd gone to the University of Lashkar, and his mother had been a professor there previously. That was just night and day different from where we were. And you also were so close down to the border with Pakistan. So there was this fairly porous border, and we would receive the intelligence reports of out-of-area fighters coming through, and you'd hear them on the radio. You'd hear different accents. And we became almost the test ground for new weapons coming into theatre, because there were just absolute porous border with Pakistan. So, the first time underslung grenade launchers were being used in theatre, it was sort of in our area because they were easy to get across, and there would be, Chechenian fighters coming, and mercenaries and other more ideological driven fighters from around the world. And they'd obviously come in from the south and then make their way up north. So you could almost see the ink blot map of new weapons coming into theatre, and we were kind of at that nexus. So I think it's always had the reputation, the whole province, as being sort of the heart of the insurgency. And then when I was there, that was the time when President Obama surged sort of 40-odd thousand more forces into the area. So just kick the hornet's nest. You start taking out leaders, you create power vacuums, jostling of international forces, leaving overlaps like we were in, where suddenly everyone sort of left. That was my sort of understanding of it. It was just all they knew, that the people, there was nothing else. There was no infrastructure. There was no electricity. There weren't shops, schools. It was just farm fight, desert, green zone. That was it.
And who were you to them? And the reason I ask you in particular, because I think this is, and I totally appreciate the fact that you saying you're not an expert and you have a limited on the ground experience, but I think this is the lived experience of those who we send forth to fight our wars, which we don't often hear about, as to how you contextualize the role you're playing on the ground there and then. Yes, we can hear from all the experts, the strategic vision or lack thereof, or what's being discussed in Doha, in Washington, in London, in Canberra, etc. But we very rarely hear of those who, and I didn't know that you were in charge of that base ultimately for the last 3 months. How did you feel there, and how did the locals view you? Who were you to them? How did they consider you? What relationship did they have with you? Because I'd imagine not all of them were Taliban as clearly defined, right?
I would go so far as to say, the idea, we didn't even use the term Taliban. It was such an esoteric notion of who was there. Insurgents were the people that were fighting you at the time, whether it was ideological, whether they were, aligned to the Taliban, or whether they were just pissed off. It could be anything in between. The part that I found interesting, talking to my peers that deployed in other provinces, that when they were mentoring Afghan forces and working with interpreters closely, I never had any of that. It was that warfighting interaction. There was nothing more. So I dare say to those people, I was a faceless jerk on the top of a hill who kept dropping bombs on them. No conversations. I didn't once have a conversation with an Afghan that wasn't someone working. We had some locally employed civilians in the kitchen, an interpreter, but he only worked over the radio listening to ICOM chatter, so we weren't out patrolling hearts and minds. the first part of the tour, the Danish were making that footprint felt. And that was your more conventional go out and try to project our presence into that area, bring stability, doing missions like securing bridges so that they could, get commerce going on east-west across the river. There was a national election when I was there, so go and secure polling stations, denial patrols to try and, clear IED caches or clear weapons caches, take out high-profile leaders. But towards the end of the tour, we weren't able to force project. So we'd lost too many forces to be able to project out. We'd lost most of our armoured vehicles, either to IED strikes or being withdrawn. So our perimeter just sort of shrunk. And if you think about any of your defensive operations, we were losing because we weren't projecting out. So they had complete freedom of movement up to and around our base. So we sort of just became like, let's hold up and not get overrun. So for me, I had no relationship with the Afghan people apart from watching them, and you'd watch day and night from your sensors, from the watch points. You'd watch them farm. You'd start to understand their pattern of life. Their buildings all had nicknames, that had a very practical purpose because it gave you the quickest way to. No one knows what you're talking about, and you say, I've been attacked from compound 43B or something, but you say, we're getting shot at from Hollywood. We're getting shot at from Grenade Wall. But that was really it. It was desensitized. It was faceless. It was standoffish. And I imagine for them it was exactly the same. We were just that. We would have been like this, thing on the hill overlooking them. And because we were there, IEDs were there because, as you say, I'm sure so many of them were just farmers going about their day. But because we were there, the area was just riddled with IEDs. No one benefits from, shooting happening across a paddock because they guarantee there's some people in that paddock who are laying on their guts just hoping not to get shot. No one benefits from dropping high explosives in and around compounds. So I dare say they didn't think very highly of me, and I didn't know them at all.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's not often one hears that side of the that kind of side of the close combat, especially as an artilleryman. It's certainly not a common story. It's without a doubt you've had an exceptionally complex deployment, and I dare say one of the hardest ones that our peers have deployed to. But what are some of the most standout moments, given how intense it was throughout your? So you said you were actually in country for about 7 months then?
Yeah, it was about 7 months. Yeah.
Yeah. So what would you say would be kind of your standout memories that you've taken away from those 7 months?
Yeah. Look, there's so many, good and bad. And again, I sort of want to caveat it by saying, if it sounds like I'm glorifying it all, I'm not attempting to, but that period of time it's larger than life in my mind. And I think you would have spoken to a lot of people that when you come back from that absolute heightened intensity where every sensor in your body is alert, it feels like you've been staring at the sun, and you come back to normal life and everything is just a sort of pale imitation of the real deal. The goods aren't as good, the bads aren't as bad. So I'm not trying to glorify what happened there, but it was 100%. Some of those things were so amazing to be challenged, to feel, to have succeeded in life or death combat. There's nothing that matches
it. It's all encompassing, right? It's intoxicating. Yeah.
And that world, your world has shrunk to a few hundred meters either side of you, and it's life or death. And then when you live through it, you've won objectively. So look, the whole period for me, I felt like I really did come of age. I went there as, nervous, probably lacking in a bit of the self-confidence to really know who I was. But being there in charge of the team, the rapport I built with our guys, seeing how they performed, it just sort of helped me validate that I was good at something. I didn't know what the combo was, what the recipe was, but it's like, hey, this works. We as a team work. And then, I have memories there that it was everything that I thought a junior officer should be doing. My relationship with my senior NCOs. There was one example where we were up in a direct fire position trying to cover a patrol that were trying to withdraw in contact, and we wanted to put down a smoke screen for them. The gunnery computer wouldn't calculate the range because it was under 600 metres. So the gunnery computer sort of said, computer says no, why would you be firing smoke rounds less than 600 metres? It couldn't calculate a fuse. So I sort of brought the junior officer wacky idea of we can direct fire smoke. And then, and I know how conceptually from a ballistic way, if we just calculate the muzzle velocity of that round and the distance, we can reverse engineer a fuse setting. But then I had the warrant officer with me with the 20 years of knowledge. When I could say, what's the muzzle velocity of a such and such round at charge one, he'd spit it off the top of his head. And we'd say, okay, let's make up a fuse setting on the fly, just set them by hand. First one sputtered deep into the mud. So, okay, our maths suck. Wind the fuse back by half a centimetre. But, laying down a direct fire smoke, smoke screen, us taking rounds on our position, covering a patrol in contact. It was just what I thought I was supposed to be doing. And then as that kinetic intensity ramped up, the fighting ramped up. And the culmination point of it, the guys that were there, it's seared in all our memories. There was towards the very end of the tour, we'd had increasingly kinetic attacks sort of around that September period, because I remember one of them happened on September 11, but sort of August 21st, because it was my birthday. There was a big attack, and I'd been we had the satellite phones, where you got it 20 minutes a week of credit on a satellite phone. And I was talking to Fee at the time. Then we came in contact and it was sort of like, hit hang up, and I didn't communicate with her for a couple of days.
Sorry, baby, got to go.
I didn't communicate with her for a few days afterwards. I said, it was nothing. The phone just dropped out. And then afterwards she found out what had happened and she grilled me. But they were increasingly probing our position. And so to set the scene, by that stage, we hadn't patrolled out in well over a month or two. IEDs, we were taking IED strikes when we did try to go out within 30 metres of the wall. So people would crawl up under the cover of dust storms and lay IEDs basically under our watch positions. So you could go out to try and check a claymore cable, or to check we had, a couple of layers of, concertina razor wire. You could go out to try and clear those and not make it. So it was essentially just give up, just hold the position. They had, they mentioned that whole election campaign was going on. So they had, people attacking us from different areas, range of weapons. It was, you remember back to our lessons, sitting in the theatre at Duntroon, and you'd go through Russian weapons and learn their ranges. And you're like, what a waste of time. We actually started playing bingo of all the weapons that were, like SPG-9s, ZSU-23s, ththese ridiculous, like, I'm getting shot at by a Russian anti-aircraft weapon. What is going on in my life? So it just culminated in this one attack sort of mid-October, and it was a genuine sustained attack to try and overrun the base. And I remember watching it. It's just seared into my memory that I got called up to one of the sangars, and we saw 3 people crawling up through the green zone, and sort of, it was like they were on a shoot site, so for those that, again, the listeners that don't understand the shoots, the training you would do where you're looking at the hill and you say, how would I attack this? And it was almost like they had a staff member with them. There were 3 of them there and pointing at us, and they were sketching on the ground. And I thought, okay, that's 3 people running a mud model of how to attack me. And as the sun started to come down, we thought that's probably when we're going to get hit. And we started to see some people move into positions. The rules of engagement we were under were self-defense only. So basically wait to get shot at before you can shoot back. Or, hand on heart, genuine threat, just someone moving with a weapon's not enough. You don't have to wait to get shot, but if you see them raise a weapon in your direction, if you can put your hand on heart and say it was self-defense, you're okay. We saw someone move up, move a PKM, sort of a heavy machine gun into position, and we had a few armoured vehicles left with us, the CV9, so it sort of just creeped up to a wall, optics just above the wall so he could see it, and, someone with a radio so that we're going to get some indirect fire as well. And so I was in the command centre at that stage looking through optics and using the radios, talking to people, and I sort of said, as soon as we take a mortar round in, kill that guy with the radio, and then obviously, it's weapons clear as soon as people start engaging us. And it kicked off there at sort of just on dawn, just on dusk, which was from memory around 6 p.m, with sort of heavy machine gun fire, mortar rounds, and it kicked on for about the next 3 to 4 hours. And it was, we're getting attacked from 3 directions simultaneously, nearly achieving break-in. They were up to our perimeter wall, sort of, I remember when I did the roundup at the end of your casualty and ammunition that you'd expended, I was tallying the list, and I was like, who's been firing 9mm? And it was, one of the forward observers' acts up on the wall with his 9mm firing off the side of the wall down at the people below. It was sort of, coming in and trying to climb the walls to get over. So just sustained RPGs, mortars, they're heavy weapons, so they had that anti-aircraft gun that was taking chunks out of us. I was on sort of all the different nets at once, talking to people on the radio, calling for backup. I was getting sent the note that I didn't want to get across one of the secret networks that was sort of saying, when you get broken into, just accept break-in in the south and fight your way back to the northern wall. And they were dispatching the QRF from Fob Price, which was going to be some tanks. So they were going to crash some Abrams tanks through the wall and get us to fight back behind the tanks and sort of try and get us out that way. And I sort of was reading this message going, hey, can we go with an if, please, not a when? I get overrun.
Yeah.
And
to
sort of highlight anecdote.
The fact that you can laugh at it is better, but I mean, it's obviously no laughing matter. But geez, that's pretty intense.
At the time, it was one of those, and then you're trying to project calmness down the radio to people, not letting them know quite how bad it is. The guys describe it to me as almost a scene out of Star Wars, because it was the strangest things that stick in your memory, but obviously we had red tracer rounds and they were largely using old era Russian and Chinese rounds, which are green tracer. So it was just red and green tracer arcing across the position. And then it's the most bizarre, almost satirical moment, but I was sitting in this command center, you just got everything squawking at you. You've got radios on different nets. You've got the local command net. The Danes had broken into Danish by then because they were they were sort of in extremely high stress mode as well. So you've got different languages chirping at you, and the phone rang like a normal telephone rang on the mission secret network. I ignored it for a while and picked it up. What? And it was an American JTAC from a neighboring patrol base. And he'd heard our radio chatter and knew what was going on. And I didn't have a TACSAT, so I couldn't talk to aircraft because we'd lost our JTAC. So he had queued up a British Apache helicopter on his TACSAT, and he was just jamming a press switch of his radio to his phone. And so I sort of got patched into this British Apache through a landline telephone in this TOC. And it was, just bizarre moment of calling in this Apache on our own position. So there were moments like that. I remember one moment slightly earlier in the tour that I was in my best footy shorts and pluggers, thongs, and I'd just been in the gym, and we started taking mortar rounds. So I sprinted to the headquarters, sprinted to the TOC. We had a light counter mortar radar, so we had a 10-figure grid of the firing point that we were getting shot at. But I couldn't raise the gun line on the radio to pass the grid to them. And it turned out that the line had been broken. And it's again this mix of World War I crap. We were running Don 10 tannoy line, and the mortar rounds had blown up our line. So I scribbled the grid down on the 10-figure grid on my hand and did what I thought would be a heroic dash to the gun line through this mortar fire. Saw an RPG come sailing in over the top of hit the deck, and it's just skimmed over my head. Had a plugger blowout. So I'm sort of, thinking, what am I doing?
No, got to stop, mate. That's it. That's end of the war then, mate.
Okay, you've blown out my one...
RPG and everything, no worries.
This is inhumane. You've blown out my one set of pluggers. How am I supposed to shower?
That's it.
Get to the gun line. And that was the first time that we really said, hey, we're going to think liberally here. There was no forward observer, so we couldn't follow the normal procedures, and it was sort of, hang on, who's calling in the fire mission? And that's when we pivoted to direct fire, because I've got the grid and I'm here and I can see the firing point. I'm the observer now. So we sort of just started calling in a lot of direct fire. All the guns by that stage were built up on these berms to above the level of the HESCO walls, because we found they'd found on an earlier tour that, with the difference of the gun sort of sitting here and the HESCO wall being higher, you had to elevate to a certain trajectory just to clear the wall. So then it left this dead zone that you couldn't engage. So by digging the guns up, you counterintuitively gave away your only protection, because you were no longer behind a wall, but you could depress the guns and achieve direct fire. So just look, 7 months of incidental memories like that are pretty well seared in.
How did you get away without any casualties?
Luck, I think. So at our patrol base and in the tour, we took heavy casualties. So out of the British rotation, again, the numbers are foggy. I think it was 80 odd killed on our tour, British, from our brigade. We lost one from our battery, who was FOAC on patrol, so not out of our patrol base. And there are a few more from the regiment that were killed. The Danish we were with lost heavily. So the Danish lieutenant that I was working with lost both his legs in an IED strike and was killed. We evacuated him onto a helicopter, but he died on the way out. Other people from the patrol base, one of the drivers was killed in another IED strike. Mortimer, triple amputee, died. So there were many people killed in the patrol base and from our battery and from our regiment, but the sort of 14 of us Aussies literally just dodged bullets, I think, and it's that chaotic part of war. You can miss it by an inch or you can miss it by a mile, and some days you step on the IED and someone steps one foot to the side and doesn't. So
yeah, that's absolutely incredible. How did your soldiers fare after that deployment?
Mixed, an Allen's mixed bag of lollies, I'd say. An incredibly tight bunch. One guy who I won't name refused to come back from Rockall, so relief out of country leave. So the sort of mid tour, he just refused to come back. And that was a breach of trust. The feelings of the guys for him were not kind. And, again, everyone has their reasons, but in that environment, you did need to make that commitment to something other than yourself. And by opting out of the team, it screwed everyone else. You fight a man down. There's no one sends a reinforcement. No one sends a replacement. You just had to go the last 5 months of the tour a man down. So he obviously was feeling the effects even at the time. And I know I'm still in touch with all the guys and a lot of the British guys as well. It's really impacted people differently. Some have shown similar issues to me, and we talk through that and we work through it. Others seem pretty fine with it. Others probably struggling in their own way, maybe don't recognise it. Some maybe struggling in their own way, don't feel comfortable talking to me about it. So I think it's a bond that brought us all together. And I know, many of them went deployed on other rotations and sort of just reflected that it just wasn't the same. It was just like we'd played the biggest game of our lives and everything after that. So most of them got out very quickly afterwards. And I think the feeling was common amongst us. It sort of just felt like the army was play acting after that. It was almost like we just did that. That was real. That was the absolute ultimate of our roles. What have you got left for me, army? And I think most people, the shine came off after that, and mixed degrees of disillusionment. The fact that you were never going to do something like that again.
You used the words before when you're describing your time in those 7 months as your world reducing, and that you became desensitized, and that it was, that was kind of it. Describe for me this idea of desensitized. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, look, it's such an interesting one, and it's probably the thing that I think for me led to so many of my, longer term issues down the track. I think it becomes the process for me of desensitizing starts as a survival mechanism and as a coping strategy. If you're being asked to kill and you're seeing these things around you,
it's almost welcomed in that sense.
It is, it's adaptive in that environment because you can't function without it. You can't, deal with the death of someone and give yourself time to grieve because the decision needs to be made in the next second. And there are a few tipping points for me during the tour where I remember thinking, what's happening to me? It was obvious to me that I was becoming desensitized, or potentially that I was getting to like a Jedi Master level of compartmentalizing. I separated myself largely from home. I was completely dismissive of the sort of Australian style welfare hub, which didn't really have it. There was sort of one computer that the Danish had, and you could get on Facebook Messenger from time to time if you went there at 3 a.m. or something. I just didn't bother. I didn't bother with the sat phone. I spoke to Fee maybe once a fortnight, once every 3 weeks, because it felt like that was there and I'm here. And the more I am in that world, the less I am focused on this world. And this world is survival. And so, as an example, one of the guys from our battery that was killed, I was told over the radio had been killed, and I had to pass the news on to the team. And I remember telling them, and it echoed with me for a long time afterwards, how little I felt. I couldn't quite picture his face. It was like I was telling people the milk had arrived. I was able to just completely compartmentalize and go, he's dead. That's done now. I have to tell the team so that they know. But also, patrol's out in 5 minutes. So, move on. And some of the guys who were very close to him, schoolmates with him, were torn apart. And I remember at the time going, whoa, what's that? That to me is a normal human reaction. Why am I not feeling any of that?
What's happened to me?
And I think that environment does it. The death is everywhere. There was a time where we used to refer to them as own goals if someone digging in an IED blew themselves up. And it was a source of great hilarity when, someone digging in an IED would blow up, because by the end of the tour, you'd hear the bang, and if it didn't come with rounds incoming, you just, it's not worth getting out of bed for. And I remember we had a Danish doctor who had recently joined the rotation, and they were, the Danish doctors were what we would think of as sort of a reservist. So he was a civilian doctor doing military service. And we were on the wall together, and there was an IED blast. We didn't have a patrol out, so immediately you go, don't really care. And we watched the footage, and it was a guy who'd gone into the waddy probably to lay the IED. Might have just been an unlucky guy, but more than likely he was trying to set an IED and blew himself up. And we watched him. He's still alive. He wasn't instantly killed. He just maimed, and we watched him sort of trying to crawl towards us, probably a couple of 100 meters away. And the Danish doctor said, we've got to go out and get him. Like, that's an injured person. Sort of, by the Hippocratic Oath, I'm going to go get that person. And I remember we just looked at him like, are you batshit mad? Like, no, we're not. Like, where there's one IED, there's more. And you can just sit on the wall and watch someone bleed out and go, oh, well, he was trying to lay an IED.
Crack on.
Or maybe wasn't, but not my problem. Another incident, I remember someone getting blown up by an IED, a local, and seeing the kids come from the local town to come pick up the body parts. And they brought a big bed sheet out with them, essentially. And these are young kids all going out to, pick up the body parts of Uncle Bill, chuck him in this sort of, grip it up like a little rucksack and drag him back home. And I just thought that world where, the people over there, that's their life, raised in that. So the desensitization we feel is nothing compared to what they go through. But it was noticeable, right? Like even, it's probably a bit of a, not the most pleasant of conversations, but even the pornography the guys were watching, I remember noticing it got increasingly more extreme. It was like the base level of human arousal just raised throughout the tour. And I don't just mean sexual arousal, your attention state. It took
everything.
The first time when you're in theatre and you hear a gunshot, everyone, whoa, what was that? Scramble to the walls, get to positions. Is that us? Are we not? First IED strike. Holy crap, where was that? What do we do? And by the end, you don't get out of bed unless, you really, okay, yeah, that's actually us getting shot. Or even if it's us getting shot, you're like, no, the Sangers have got it. I'm not getting out of bed for that one. And the level of everything just became more visceral, more graphic. So I think that's the real dehumanizing part, to protect yourself from the reality of killing, being killed, facing death. As a young officer, having to make decisions that you knew bore a reasonable likelihood were going to kill the people that you were in charge of and were close with. And I found the sort of the bombardiers, corporal equivalents tended to be about my age as a young lieutenant. And you'd look at these people who you just spent 7 months, a year in Australia training with, 7 months in the UK training and living with, and then on this tour together, living and sleeping together. And you go, that's a branch in the road of, there's no class structure, as you well know. That is a different choice at recruiting. And we were friends. We were, for all intents and purposes, could have been very similar people. Another turn at recruiting, and I could have ended up with them, or they could have ended up at Duntroon next to us. But you then still had to be able to compartmentalize and say, but I need you to go out and do that. I need you to go and lead that clearing patrol, or I need you to push that gun to the top of that hill out into harm's way and man that direct fire position. And if you get killed in the doing so, that's what we're all here for. So I just think it was a necessity to be able to compartmentalize and desensitize yourself from the fact that you couldn't rip yourself apart at the time of going, is this the right decision? What if they get killed? Am I responsible? What have I done? So I'd say that's the micro level. And then at the macro level, the whole conflict, it was, I recognized while I was there just the abject stupidity of what we were doing. As I mentioned at the start, that notion of they're fighting me because I'm here, and then I keep killing them so they come back and fight me again. It's exactly, I'd sort of read all of Kilcullen's stuff, and you go, we're doing this wrong. But it wasn't within my sphere of influence to change the strategy of the war, or even when withdrawals are announced and you say, okay, we've lost now, but all I can actually influence is trying to keep my people as safe as I can and do it, just war theory. I can fight this little part of the war in a just way. I can make sure we do the right thing. I can make sure, to the best of my ability, I keep us safe and we all get home alive. And I just had to put my horsey blinkers on outside that and go, I can't think about the futility of this war. I can't think about whether it's the right thing for us to be here. We've been sent here. We are here. And now we just have to get out.
Given that desensitization and the callousness that you had to embody to do your job, how hard was it to comply with the just war tradition and the principles so deeply embedded in our folklore, if nothing else? It was
really hard. And I remember I got into a bit of strife at when I'd returned to Australia, there was a sort of the CO's professional military education. You'd go to the mess and you'd talk through experiences, and I was asked to speak about it. And I was really bothered by this notion that people really thought like Australians are different. Australians would never commit war crimes. Gee whiz, we've seen the sort of the fallacy of that over time potentially. But I think it was that there's something to be proud about our culture, but there's also no need to be naive and pretend that doesn't affect human beings. I felt genuinely at the time, and I say this with absolute love and respect to the guys, as the young officer there, I was the one with a pack of rabid dogs on the lead. These were guys that they were desensitized and trained to kill. And I feel there was that we were like hemmed in, attacked daily, it was claustrophobic. You just wanted to escape and you couldn't. You had to stay and hold ground. And we knew full well that the people that we were watching by day in the paddocks were the ones fighting us by night. And it's an experiment that never came to pass. But if you'd gone up into one of those sangers and said, the next time the shooting starts, just take out that field. We know it's them. If it's not them today, it's going to be them tomorrow. And I think that would have happened. And people got so offended at this PME session. They said, no, not Australians. They'd never do that. I said, well, why do we fundamentally think Australian soldiers are different to American soldiers or British soldiers or any human being who is under that prolonged stress? And so that's when I think, people say, what's the role of the young officer? And it was to draw that morality line and say, like, yes, that could happen. And I feel it too. But we are here to do it differently. And I have to keep a very close check on, we have rules of engagement. We have the things that safeguard us from crossing that precipice. And I distinctly remember one time we'd lost some people to an ID strike by day. And it was one of the few times that I dealt with Afghans. They came we had a walk-in area, sort of a CIMIC. You could come approach the patrol base, high as kites, right? So they're all, on opium and high as kites, 3 fighting age males jokingly coming in, and we were a laughing stock to them. So they basically came in, and we had a CIMIC officer at the time who did the usual: do you want rice? Do you want this? This is what I can give you. No, we want a car battery, and it had been a car battery ID that had killed one of our people that day. We need a new car battery that we've used ours up today, that type of thing. And I could have, I to this day, we knew it was them, they knew it was them. They were having a great old laugh, full of opium confidence, knowing that we wouldn't do anything. Obviously, not going to give them a battery, but I could have pulled out my pistol and shot them all on the spot and gone and slept like a baby, knowing full well that it was them, and I'd just taken 3 fighters out of the game. But you can't do it. And you have to hold yourself to a higher standard of they're exploiting our rules of engagement as weakness. But it's a slippery slope of that is a war crime. I know it. You know it. That's not what we're there to do. And I think if you don't hold on to that element of your humanity, that you're going to fight the war in a different way, because you can't drag yourself down to the level of the conflict. Otherwise, it does just become all-encompassing. And I think that's where people ever struggle to come back from it, the sort of that internal wound. Yeah.
And I'd imagine, as I alluded to at the start, I've always known you as being somebody who's, strong of will and a person of deeply developed character. And, there are many of those in our peer group. I'm not trying to elevate you to some unreasonable pedestal, but you certainly, were always a standout performer. But I wonder how many others would have been able to handle that pressure in the same way. And I don't say this to demean anybody, but war impacts and those conditions impact people differently. It was an interplay of you and all your personal history interplaying with that environment. And I guess for the luck of your guys and those people you were there with, and probably your own sanity, you made the decisions that you hopefully can sleep with at night. But I'd imagine there would have been a lot of people who wouldn't have been able to, not because they're bad people, because they're evil, but because they just come into this with different personal history, different personal sensitivities, traumas, ability to desensitize, to compartmentalize. And again, this is not casting shame on anyone, but that I feel is just the reality of it.
Yeah, look, and I think it's a really interesting thing that I've reflected on over the years, which is the things that make you adaptive in theatre can be the very things that make you maladaptive back home and can go too far. So I always noticed it, not so much in training at Duntroon, but, on sort of career courses and other things like that, where I did notice that I seemed to just have an ability to operate rationally at a higher level of stress. A JTAC course that I did when I came back, and it's all about absorbing information and multiple language, multiple radio feeds and thinking in a 3D battle space. And you just watch people hit the barrier where their brain just goes, nope, I need to do this one thing and then I need to do that thing. And they're not dumb people, but it would be you've got an instructor on your shoulder pushing you. Where are we at? What are we doing? And it was an ability to just be able to block it all out and just make rational decisions that I found then in theatre just ramped to a whole nother level of, and you watch people start to panic, the emotions start to overcome. So being able to suppress emotion, make rational decisions, operate off logic, and just follow drills of, this is what I need to do, gunnery drills, fire drills, protect the base.
If then. Yeah.
And constantly that I'm one of those people that narrates my life in my head as I go. Constantly, what if, what then, what next? If. The British mantra, it was at what when you're doing your situation reporting, and what if, what next, what then? Always contingency planning, always thinking about what could happen. And I find I still do it. I think about where conversations might go. I wonder if they're going to say this. What will I? And I use it in business. What are they thinking? What's my angle? Where can I get in? What are they going to say? And so I found that I think a part of that might just be a part of our own upbringing, and something that I only realised later on in life. I always thought that was a great thing, because it just doesn't manifest as openly bad. Wow, you deal well under pressure. You make great rational decisions. You can deal with stress. This is awesome. And business, when I stepped out of the military, rewards it. You can make the hard, logical decisions. You can analyse numbers quickly. You don't get flustered. But a big part of what I realised was probably stopping me, like the more human response in a time of high stress is to feel good, feel bad. Someone's dead. That hurts. Like, I don't want to just be able to compartmentalize and move on. So when you step out of that environment, it's those things that were so rewarded and became so ingrained with me that actually help you assimilating back into having a full and meaningful life. So I think there is certainly an element of you become a gold medalist of compartmentalizing. And so a theory that I'd worked through, more recently with a counsellor was about, there was a bit of a history of alcoholism in my family, and she was pointing to me in the direction of some studies that children who are raised in that environment often become very self-reliant. If there's alcohol in a family, and that same sort of a child's need, like, whoa, someone's numb, I'm not getting that. I learn to self-validate, self-orientate, make your own decisions. So who knows? We're all a complex melting pot of experiences, upbringings, personalities. And I think that moral side, that moral compass, I genuinely don't know. I think it comes down to, I don't think anyone could assess from the outside who would do it and who wouldn't. I'm sure there are people that would have not have that right balance, but then it could have been one of the senior NCOs would have stepped in and gone, this officer is not going to call the shots. I need to. It could have been a gunner who just says, I refuse to. So I don't think it was like I was holding it all. If I had failed, the whole strength of the team was there were checks and balances, and they were all fundamentally good people. My fear in those situations is if no one makes the call, and that group mentality, if everyone starts doing it, if someone had started shooting, holy shit, maybe that's when it all could have kicked off.
Well, I mean, I think we've seen that very example play out in Mila, and that's one of those kind of case studies that's studied for that very point, right? Poor orders, unclear guidance, difficult circumstances, as you described it, a pack of rabid dogs almost ready to kind of unleash the fury of death upon anyone. And what you've described perfectly matches that type of a scenario had it not been. And again, I don't intend to elevate you to some sort of a pedestal, but you and also certainly the people undoubtedly around you, because again, that is part of the interplay and the interpersonal relationships that exist. And I'd imagine the respect that you, whether consciously or non-consciously, your soldiers wanted to hold you in a high esteem that you obviously had earned, and you wanted to retain that. That of course has an impact. That has a role in shaping behavior. Nobody wants to slip off a status that they had achieved. So the status will maintain you. And same for them, right? If you've elevated them and given them certain status, they wouldn't want to just lose that because they're going crazy. And this is grossly oversimplifying, obviously. But I think the point you're trying to make echoes very, very clearly in my mind, that the environment and what you've described as the desensitizing environment has a truly degrading effect on our humanity, for lack of a better word, and it takes a strong moral compass and strong internal motivation and validation within one's environment to sustain that, to remain above the let's call it threshold of what we consider moral, ethical, legal, in a war where the enemy is anyone. And I think that's another really interesting, important point to highlight here, that as you stressed time and time again, anybody in those fields by day is just a farmer, but by night is a mortal enemy. I think this is a really insightful piece of the conversation that I just want to double click on. But maybe we can pivot now to your returning back home, because we've alluded to some of the issues that you've subsequently faced. Maybe you can talk us through how that occurred, and I guess at which point you realized that something was wrong, and then what did you find out when you put your hand up?
Yeah, look, there's really two parts of it. I think there's I recognized in myself something wasn't quite right very soon after getting back. So I returned, end of 2010, took some post-deployment leave, posted up to Townsville 2011, had a very supportive boss up there, the same CO that had come and done my sort of in-country in the UK validation and sent me off on the deployment finally. So I can't remember exactly when in that year, but I started to, some of the more textbook symptoms, I guess you'd think of. Never really experienced, nightmares. My trauma wasn't the one distinct incident. I think it was that, probably kind of typical compression, the bucket filling and filling and filling and never decompressing. So I just was always at that tipping point of boiling over. So, the anger, irritability, fatigue, just that constant. I never noticeably had trouble falling asleep or staying asleep. I never sort of woke up with nightmares or couldn't get to sleep, but I just was exhausted, which I think was a sign to me that just the sleep wasn't working. I wasn't probably dreaming. I wasn't processing healthily. And the other thing about that desensitization we spoke about is I think it drills into you that there's no fight or flight anymore. There's just fight. And it was like I'd lost the other coping mechanisms. My reactions had gone from nothing to a tipping point and then fight. And, you remember me from the early days. I've always had that ability to, I think controlled aggression, but sometimes becomes uncontrolled, which again, in the right circumstance.
And you're a big lad, just for context. I mean, how tall are you?
6'5".
Right. Okay. Just so people understand that you're a big lad.
So I think it's adaptive in the right environment, because when you trigger, for me at least, that's adrenaline, and you ignore pain and you pick someone up and throw them over your shoulder and you can achieve things, but you try to bring that back into a normal world. I'd find myself, not pretty cool and calm most of the time, but the wrong thing flips my switch and I'd be shouting at a tradesman who's trying to rip me off with a quote, or, just absolutely oblivious, shouting in the office for something. So I started to think, this isn't quite right. But I was in what I felt was a very supportive environment, a microcosm within the military. So that was then Lieutenant Colonel Charles Weller was my CO. He set a very high standard amongst the unit. He was, to me, that sort of the amazing mix of a strong leader, physically strong, mentally robust, caring, compassionate. He just balanced it so well. And to me, he was a human being. He was the first commanding officer I'd seen who was human, who would say, hey, my wife's on deployment as well, so I need to go pick up my girls. I was like, wow, this guy's the real human being. So I think that rapport and trust let me open the door. So I went and saw the GP on base, who referred me through to a psychiatrist pretty quickly, a military psychiatrist who pretty quickly diagnosed me with PTSD, got me into some therapy, got me on antidepressants, just stock standard sort of SSRIs. So I didn't go too deep down the rabbit hole. I didn't really, float with the fringes of excessive drinking, and it's caught it quite early and thought, I'm going to get on top of this. But I think of that as sort of recovery 1.0, where my recovery goal was, look, almost just that triage approach. Just get me good enough to just
to stabilize.
And there were a few things. I'd be walking the dog in the morning, sort of, pre-dawn, because it's Townsville and it's stinking hot, and I'd start to, if I looked over my shoulder, I'd have the feeling that there were, rationally, I knew there was nothing behind me, but irrationally, I'd feel fear. I'd feel I was being followed, pursued, and I'd sometimes end up running, and again, it's just that you'd convince yourself, you're like, no, I'm just jogging home. That's the only reason I'm running, but actually you're shit scared for some reason. So I thought, just get rid of that. Just get rid of that, please. The CEO at the time moved me. I was fairly open.
That's again
about
very
everything.
rational. Sorry to interrupt you there, but this strikes me as again very rational compartmentalization again. Hey, just switch that off for me, please, so I can keep doing what I'm doing. Just give me whatever you need to take, to numb that, nullify that emotion, that feeling, which is again this kind of rational approach to dealing with these, deeply internal messages that are manifesting.
And I wonder if partly it's because I didn't know what good looked or felt like. So again, it was quite irrational. I'd read enough. I was educated enough to go, I don't want to be one of those people that ignores PTSD and ends up, a catatonic mess in 30 years' time. So I better deal with this. But dealing with it at that time for me meant, can't we just do like a quick course of meds or something, and I'll go speak to a counsellor a few times. It'll be good. I'll be back on track. Bang me on the next deployment. The inevitable stigma there in a military unit. By that stage, I had the self-confidence coming off the back of that deployment to go, I just don't give a shit what anyone thinks of me. So I was happy to talk to the gunners and say, I'm medically downgraded because I'm on, because I've got PTSD and they put me on medication. There's the idiotic things, you're not allowed to carry a weapon then. So the CO moved me into a headquarters role. So it was in a way just less obvious that I wasn't carrying a weapon. So, a good supportive environment for things like that. But it was hard. The unit then deployed because I was off kilter, having, just deployed with the British. So then I came back, posted to an Australian unit that was deploying. So I became like the stay-at-home dad. And then really the only offensive support to the other battalions in the brigade. So an incredibly busy year outfield. So really, I kind of gave it a pretty half-assed crack at recovery. I posted to School of Langs the following year. Didn't like the medication, combination of headaches, and I didn't like the stigma of being on medication. I didn't like having to take something. And I think once the most acute symptoms were out of the way, I sort of went, hey, I'm good now. So I posted to School of Languages in Melbourne, where there was a civilian doctor who didn't know the process too well. So instead of a very long upgrade process of weaning off the medication and they called welfare boards and upgrading through the medical process, I just stopped taking the meds and went to him and sort of said, hey, I used to take meds, but I'm good now. Can you upgrade me? And he went, oh, geez, I don't even know what you're talking about. Sure. So I got myself medically upgraded. And then, sort of fit to deploy again, essentially. And that was probably it for, that would have been 2013. And that's probably about where I left it. I think I just sort of put a stopper on the worst of the symptoms, and I'd still have these blowouts now and then, sort of, these once every 6 months or so real rage blowout where I'd just lose it in the gym at someone or lose it in the car at something. Blackout drunk was a pretty common go-to. I say, I was just a binge drinker, not a regular drinker in the way that only the military can say just binge drinking. dining nights, write myself
Yeah.
off, weddings, write myself off. But I sort of said, that's not PTSD. That's just me. That's just what you do in the army. I didn't really see a problem with it because that culture is everywhere. So that was sort of the first go around the buoy, then get married, start having kids, fast forward a few years. And I guess it was, only in the last few years that I really started to want something more. And it's the kids that brought that to life for me. That I always had this objective sort of fear that I'd seen people in other relationships, including my parents, just parent, but not really have a relationship. So I sort of academically knew that I wanted to make sure Fee and I always kept a relationship strong through kids, and I wanted to be a good dad, and I thought I had an image of what that looked like. But my later years in the military and everything I started to do since, it just felt like I was going through the motions of, I'm doing the right things. I'm being successful. I've transitioned out of the military. I've got a good job. I keep getting promoted. Everyone tells me I'm doing the right things. I have a great wife. I have kids. Why am I not content? And I just thought maybe that's what life was. Just always. I wasn't overtly depressed. I wouldn't have thought. I wasn't, jumping every time there were cars backfiring or any of those kind of stereotypical symptoms. It was just sort of a malaise that ran through it all. Like life was a bit of a big sigh.
Okay.
And so as the kids, I've got 4 kids, the two oldest boys, and, we just had our third, so now we've got 2 girls. And I found myself just yearning for more. I was objectively going through the motions of what a good parent should do. I'm reading with the kids, dropping them to school. I'm present. I'm not working too hard. I'm setting a work-life balance. I'm there for Fee. I was drinking increasingly more and more. But again, I just didn't see it as a problem. It's, but I work hard. All the lies you tell yourself, I work hard. So I should be allowed to have a beer. But in hindsight, I think there was a fair numbing self-medication going on there.
What were you numbing from? Do you know?
I don't really know. Again, because it wasn't like a specific memory. It wasn't, recurring dreams. I think it was just that process of compartmentalizing from the world. I didn't want to be a part of it. I still had that worldview, and this is one of the biggest shifts for me. Take me back a couple of years, ask me about the world, and I would have said to you, but the world, people go, but you seem a bit depressed because you seem to think the world's a bad place and everyone's out to get you. And I thought, but because the world is a bad place, idiot. Like, look at it. And it's self-reinforcing. You believe the world's a bad place. You believe people are terrible. I don't want to be around them. I don't want to be out with them. And it just it's a self-manifesting process of, you look for the worst in the world. You look for the worst of people, which validates my decision to not be amongst them, to not want to join them. I didn't have a belief in humanity or the good. Even good charities, I would think, but there's an angle, virtue signaling, doing it to make themselves feel better, not actually helping anyone. Real cynical prick, probably. But I guess I was just becoming an empty vessel. And I honestly, I don't know exactly what changed. I decided to reach out and try counselling again. So I went through Open Arms, previously VVCS. I sort of called up and I said, look, I'm not where I want to be. I can't put my finger on it. I just don't feel great. I don't feel happy. I don't think I used those words because I didn't talk a lot about feelings then, but it was a restlessness. And I think at some subconscious level, I must have recognized that I was burning out, and I wanted it to be different for my relationship with, with my wife, with my kids. And there was, my third child, just around that tipping point of I was getting increasingly frayed. I'd gone through a few jobs, each time getting promoted, thinking maybe a bigger job will satisfy me. It was increasingly causing friction between Fee and I, because I had this security complex of I've got to earn more money, not because I like money or material things, but the rug's going to get pulled out at any minute. I was convinced, Doomsday is coming. I need to have the mortgage paid off. I need to make sure my kids are going to be safe. They're going to have a place to stay no matter what happens to me. So I was pushing, not enjoying life along the way. We can't spend, pay down the mortgage, build security. So that was increasingly fraying. And I found myself at one stage, barbecue, idle chit chat with someone, and they say, "Oh, what do you do for fun?" And I went, "Oh shit, I don't know. I don't have fun. I don't enjoy anything. I do things I'm supposed to do. I look after my kids. I make lunches. I drop them to school. I work hard. I lead a team at work. I'm a good husband. I'm faithful. I help out with the chores." But they're just all things. They're just things I do. None of it was about what actually makes me happy or what I want to be. So I found a counsellor I really liked and trusted, still work with her, and I just started to build it into part of my routine, just like I would gym training, going, there's a mental element there that I need to keep training. And, we just slowly peeled back the onion, addressing some of the more superficial things first and just gradually peeling apart layers. And what I loved about it, it wasn't about PTSD. It wasn't about the war. It was just life, and it doesn't matter what. Maybe some of it's from your parents. Maybe some of it's from work. Maybe some of it's army. Don't care. Let's just kind of get to the bottom of what makes you tick. And then I started to connect in really isolated batches, with these little moments of connecting to feelings again. And I had a moment, I was camping, Fee and I took the kid to a camping down by the beach. I was laying in a swag with my daughter next to me, it must be sort of 2 years old or something. So sort of snuggled up next to me, fire next to us, just staring up at the moon and the stars and, the sort of the smell of the fire, the smoke shimmering across. And I had this almost out-of-body experience of just going like, how lucky am I to have this little human being dependent on me here at this exact moment, in this country, in this exact space, to have the safety and the ability to do this. And looking at the stars, it sort of felt like this cosmic juxtaposition of all those stars out there. I'm here right now in this one moment. And it hit me in the guts, a feeling of gratitude and enormity. And I sort of thought, holy crap, like, is that what I'm missing? And that's really where I amped it up. I sort of spoke to the counsellor the next time and I said, holy shit, I think I just had a feeling. And I realised that it had been so long since I'd felt anything, because I had become so good at compartmentalising and staying in the world of rational, logical decision-making and never allowing myself to feel. But that was the good and the bad feelings. And that, I guess, that sort of kicked off the next part of the journey for me, where I started to think more proactively of maybe there's more here at play than I thought. I think I'm okay, but am I really okay? Could I be better? And when you come from an environment of being trained to be selfless, trained to put others first, it took a mindset shift for me to go, I actually have to invest in myself. I have to be a bit selfish and say, it's okay to just want to do something for yourself. And I remember my counsellor pushing me on it, saying, why, this is after seeing her for a couple of years probably, why do you come to counselling? And I could rattle off and I'd say, well, I want to be a better husband. I want to be a good husband. I want to be a good dad. I want to look after my kids. And she said, but why do you do it? And she said, you've never once said anything about yourself and what you want to do. You just want to be something for other people. And I guess it's that you can't give from an empty cup. I had to learn that I had to look inwards first. And again, just I'm throwing around the old random analogies, but the rising tide that lifts all ships. If I'm good, if I'm happy, I will then be a better husband and better for the kids. But I was trying to focus externally. What can I fix? What can I do that will make the kids happy?
Which is I think there's also the part of the male nature as well is, what can I fix? Just tell me what I need to achieve in order for you to be happy, for the kids to be happy, for everybody around me to be happy. I'll go and do it, and I will do it perfectly. So therefore, everyone should be just happy and crack on.
Totally. Give me the playbook. Hey, I've seen the movies. I'm doing dishes. I fold clothes. I do ironing. I make the kids lunches. I help them with their school reading.
Yeah.
I'm the perfect dad and husband, aren't I? Like, why aren't we all just happy? Yeah. And so then that led me down the path of thinking, what more is out there? So I started, I went back and saw my civilian GP, and I described it, and I was drinking too much by that stage, and that became another, especially during COVID. I didn't realize how much the impediment of having to drive to or from work or pick up kids or something, like there were barriers to stop me drinking. I realized once those barriers were out of the way, the danger, I guess, of being a pretty compulsive individual is I do everything 110%. If I'm training at the gym, it's going to be 110%. But if I'm drinking, like I'm going to drink the most. So I went from being a periodic binge drinker to a regular binge drinker to just sort of, a lot of your life becomes sort of blackout drunk.
A drinker, yeah.
Not who I wanted to be, but again, I was so deep in my own head that I convinced myself it wasn't really a problem. So a huge part of my recovery was an acknowledgement that I'm not controlling this. This is a problem for me. So I went and saw my GP, and we had the funniest conversation in hindsight, where I described how I was feeling. I'm just flat. At that stage, and I say this not to scare anyone, but there was a part of my brain that defaulted any form of conflict, or you could just kill yourself. I never made plans. There was a part of me that was horrified, but there was a voice in my head that anytime conflict, whether it was in the house, whether it was at work, just went, this is too hard. You could just kill yourself and this would go away. And part of my mind was there and recoiled from that and went, whoa, what was that? But it was there every day, 100 times a day, saying, just kill yourself. It'd be so easy. So I went and described this to my GP, and she said, you sound depressed. Like, have you, considered taking medication? And I sort of skeptically said, oh, yeah, what does that entail? I'm thinking med review boards and downgrades. And she looked at me like I was an idiot and said, I write your prescription. You walk next door, get prescription, take medication. Like, end of story. So I started at that stage. I I started on medication. It wasn't an exact linear approach.
So were you still in at this point?
No.
Were you still in the army?
Well and truly out. Had been out quite a few years.
Yeah. Well and truly. Okay, that's what I thought. That was my I misunderstood what you meant by the med boards.
Well, because that was my only experience before. It was a big deal to get diagnosed with PTSD, and I didn't realise that self-help is sort of only a step away. There's no stigma. No one knows I'm taking. Well, now lots of people know, but there's no need to tell anyone you don't want to tell that you're taking medication.
That's right. That's right.
Look, I was probably one of those lucky people that SSRIs seem to work for. I know they're not great for everyone, but I noticed a pretty immediate effect this time. I didn't put two and two together straight away, but very shortly afterwards, I realised that drinking was a real problem for me. And I made a conscious effort that I just thought, I see the route ahead of me, and it's not one where I stay happily married, and it's not one where I have a good relationship with my kids, and I want that more than I want a beer. So, I mentioned to you before, I think in some ways I'd be a terrible sort of scientific case study because I changed a lot of variables at once. Because I feel like most of us know the recipe. It's common sense, right? If you're depressed, don't pour liquid depressants on top of it. Start moving, do some exercise, eat well, stop drinking, and your sleep will improve. We know the key ingredients that'll start you on the journey. It's a discipline and a want to do it that's hard. So I sort of said, this is, if I'm going to go serious at this, like I'm going to do it. So I'm going to stop drinking, sort out my PT, sort out my diet, lean into counselling, and really commit myself. And I had to learn to admit vulnerability for the first time with my counsellor, with Fee, with everyone, and just acknowledge that I did actually have a problem and I needed help to get through it. And as part of that step, I had been listening to podcasts and reading about alternative therapies and MDMA, ketamine, psilocybin, I heard about Alex Lim's trial. Wasn't initially able to connect, but then I found another GP who knew him, who referred me, and I was able to join the ketamine trial, which was another one of those building blocks, I think, of bringing me to the journey that I'm on today.
So you mentioned Alex Lim a second ago, and for many in the audience, that name will be familiar because I've recently interviewed Alex Lim. And in fact, it was post-release of that episode that you and I spoke, and you effectively said that you were part of the trial and praised it. So the audience that has listened to that episode now knows what that treatment is from the doctor's perspective. But I think people would be keen to hear what it is like from somebody who's actually in the treatment. So I'll let you start where you see best, but how do you describe the treatment and the process that you've gone through and the outcomes you're getting from it?
Yeah, it's a great question. Look, maybe I'll start with, the first conversation I had with Alex, where he described to me sort of the why he was doing the program and what he was hoping to achieve and why it connected with me. And it came through in your interview with him, your podcast with him. When I met with him, he sort of said that, paraphrasing, he said it far smarter, but, that he didn't like the idea that with mental injury, it was just always going to be there and all you could ever do was treat symptoms. SSRI, level out. He went, if we had a broken arm, you're going to set the bone. And he had that same approach of sort of what's a physiological thing that's happened and can I do more than just treat symptoms? And that just resonated with how I felt. I don't want to be a victim. I don't want to be someone that for the rest of their life has to go along being impaired in some way. I want to be better than I ever was. So I was hook, line and sinker. And he described the things that happen in your brain with cortisol spiking during combat exposure, and then the chemical way that, that sort of the byproducts of ketamine that can sort of help repair neural activity in the brain, things like that, where I said, well, this sounds to me like the next step of really helping me go from understanding what's happened to me and actually taking a really positive step to fix it, not just make it less crap. The other key and really interesting part that he mentioned to me that I hadn't put a connection of, and it might be important if other people out there are listening, was he sort of described those three, the causal steps to having some kind of issue. And obviously exposure to combat was a big one, and the super high cortisol spiking. He then also spoke about exposure to repeated percussive blasts. So being one of those things that take you from, if you've seen combat experience, the likelihood of developing a substance abuse problem. He went, risk multiplier was percussive blast. So whoops, artillery, heavy gunfire, mortars, RPGs. And then the third and was any family history of substance abuse or alcoholism. So when I sort of told him my background, he kind of said, whoops, sorry, mate, but I kind of would have just seen you as a profile and gone 99% likely to develop a substance problem with something in your life. So then the trifecta of doom, which so many other people out there would have similar experience because of the Army's drinking culture, because percussive blast was part and parcel of combat. But so, look, then they accepted me into the trial. There are a few preconditions. You either had to be seeing a counsellor or be willing to see one. You had to be free of other psychiatric conditions, free of other substance abuse issues. So I'd stopped drinking before this. So that, I was young, healthy physically, so pretty good candidate for the trial. Took me a while to, initiate all the usual paperwork through DVA and the like, but it wasn't particularly onerous, just wait and see paperwork. And the trial kicked off for me with an onboarding process, which was a sort of 2-week ketamine infusion every second day. And in all honesty, I used that time doing my own reading about psychedelic treatments. I read a fantastic book by Michael Pollan, How to Change Your Mind, and listened to some podcasts in different places. but I still didn't really have a conceptual understanding of what the process would be like. I knew that ketamine was a dissociative anesthetic in high doses. The idea that it's administered in a hospital setting. I sort of had an idea of, it'd be quite sterile, and I didn't really believe the hallucination part of it. I've never experienced anything like that. It's pretty typical when you join the army at 18. You live a very straighty 180, where alcohol's the drug of choice. So this 2-week onboarding process was designed to test your sort of tolerance, size, weight, everything to ketamine. So you start at quite a low dose. The infusion process, you show up to the hospital at about 5:30 in the morning on the day of your infusion, noise cancelling headphones, eye mask recommended, and they hook you up to a cannula, IV administered ketamine on a fasted state. So it hits you like a freight train. The low doses initially were quite, I was still fairly lucid, but I started even at the very low doses to experience sort of honestly what I felt was a stereotypical trip that I would. If you watch a movie where someone's tripping, it's pretty accurate. I was seeing colors, and then basically every second day they ramped up the dose to try find a really happy blend where you're. It felt to me like you disassociated enough to be able to access your subconscious, but you're not unconscious, and also to confirm that you weren't having any negative side effects from it, and those types of sort of safety controls. So over that period, it was, even those initial experiences were life-changing for me. It started out with almost just curiosities of experiencing synesthesia, so where I could see, I could see sounds, and music would have colors to it. So I would have the sort of, I'd be listening to music and it would feel so profound to me that this song is blue, but in almost every one of this infusions, I would come away with some really a feeling of profound realization about something. And it feels like they've all felt like lucid dreams to me, where I gradually increased the dose to that period of disassociation where you are out of body and you're almost an observer of the goings on of your own thoughts, but still with enough of yourself there to be able to steer and self-direct. So I often go into the infusions with an idea of something I want to explore, a relationship, a past something. But, reflections on the importance of, a strong parental figure to my children, the feeling of care and protection. And I'd read about psychedelic experiences where when it's happening to you, it feels so profound that you just know it to be true. But I never experienced that. And it really did it. If I zoom out, what it felt like for me was I heard it described that over time in our brains we develop, as entropy increases, we wear these grooves of the path most trodden in our thought processes. And as humans, we all do it. We hear car and we go, it's a car, because it's almost always a car. But that can become debilitating when those grooves become too well trodden and depressive, and you go, you know what, it's going to be a crap day. And then that reinforces because you have a crap day. It felt like the shaking of the snow globe, I had it described as, where you sort of just, that experience just activated the neural pathways and my mind was alive. And it felt like that dissociative effect just allowed me to tap into my subconscious that I had been busy suppressing since probably before Afghanistan. And then certainly I just banged the stopper on it in Afghanistan. And it felt like my brain could just go through and slowly sift out memories, put them at the middle of this electric snow globe and explore them with almost a child's curiosity, not constrained by a single sense. It was engaging all the senses to pick apart memories, to draw connections, And it felt like a gradual process of pull that out, that memory, that something that I had suppressed, examine it, pull it apart, and then file it. Probably what I should have been doing through a healthy dreaming process, but just a 20-year bottleneck. And I was walking away making profound connections about the meaning of life, birth and death. I experienced all those feelings of myself dying and then being reborn, but in a way that was in no way scary. I sort of went into it in a trusting environment. This is being administered to me in a hospital setting by a trained anaesthetist. I'm connected to ECGs and heart rate monitors. So that sterility of the environment also provided me that backdrop of safety. And that there was one particular experience where I did think, I think what was happening was I was disassociating enough to the sense that I couldn't feel my body anymore, so I didn't know if I was breathing. And a part of my brain kind of went, maybe you're not breathing. Maybe you're dead. And there was enough consciousness there to go, but you're not, because there's an anaesthetist and an ECG and a heart rate monitor. So you're not dead. So this just must be part of something your brain's exploring. And and then that hallucination continued where I felt myself die, be buried, reborn, and sort of again the takeaway was just about that enormity of the world and how small we really are in it, and that profound feeling that the only thing that really matters is what we do in the moment. Be good, be good to the people around us, be happy, be loving, be caring. So the 2-week onboarding process was phenomenal, and then I rolled into monthly treatments. So I still go back monthly and have sort of a booster. And they're in that stage of the trial now. They've run multiple intakes, and obviously some people, depending on the severity of their symptoms, are more regular, some are further apart. And I believe what they're trying to do is find that dosage of the frequency. Is there a time when you repair and recover enough that you wean off the doses? Is this something that becomes an ongoing treatment? If so, are there any negative side effects? How often do people need it? And obviously people at different stages of their own recovery journeys. So it's been a fantastic process to be part of.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds absolutely amazing. And the insights that you're describing are just profound, as far as connecting one to the present and to what, as you describe it, is important there. And then it's that moment that you'd really so vividly describe with your daughter, lying down, camping with the fire and the stars. As you were talking, I could see that, the importance and the value of those kinds of moments, and that you get to, in this state, explore them and unpack them, and recognize their value, I guess, and contrast that with some of those other moments. And I'd imagine that a lot of it is probably not even conscious, as you rightly described. It kind of just happens, and the journey takes you wherever it takes you, right? But given everything you've talked about ketamine and its success, at least for you, why do you think it's still considered controversial?
I think it's I suspect partly it's just a long legacy and the unfamiliarity with psychedelic treatments, and that feeling that it's back alley, it's a party drug or something like that. I found that having, I was sort of separated from the military probably 7 years or so by the time I went into this experience, and so I went into it really open-minded, going, I want to see where this takes me. I want to get everything I can out of it. So when they recommend you to wear an eye mask and noise-cancelling headphones and have some relaxing music, I went all in. Others that I saw on the trial who were more recently military, or perhaps still in, I'm not sure, seem to have that more stoic, like I'm in the army, I don't do drugs.
To me. Yeah.
So give me medicine. Give me the medicine and I'll lay here and I don't need all that hippie crap. Just give me the medicine, it'll fix me. So I think it's that element of this feels different. It's unusual for people to hallucinate. That's something that hippies do. That's not something that you do in a medicinal process. So I've personally found that surrendering completely to the process has been a huge part of why I think it's been so successful for me. And I do hear anecdotes of other people when you're in the waiting room, and some people say, "Oh, I didn't feel anything. I just felt a bit woozy, had a sleep." So there's certainly, experiences may differ. And so that's all I can think of. It's just a prejudice against something that may be considered, or once was a party drug, or it feels like, honestly, it feels too good to be a medicine.
No, that makes sense. I mean, I guess that's perhaps part of the stigma. And I think it's important to stress that point you said. It's not necessarily it's not a silver bullet, and it's not necessarily going to work for everyone the same way that it's working for you. Again, because we all come into this with our own personal histories, right? Just like trauma or how trauma might eventuate, we bring our histories into play with that environment. Same here, right? Your personal history is interplaying with now this environment, and this environment that is extreme in a different way, right? It's disassociating you from your body. So I guess,
and it felt to me like
unsurprisingly,
stepping stones. On that sort of hierarchy of recovery, I viewed it as stepping stones. Where I go, well, you know what? I'm not drinking. I've sort of forced that balance on myself. Take medication, get better sleep, communicate more with a counsellor, and then I went into this almost it was always going to be win-win for me, as long as it didn't do something terrible to me, because I thought I don't need this to do anything. I'm already on a good journey. I really hope it helps. And that part but I fear that people, if they put too much expectation on it, if they expect it to be the panacea, the silver bullet, if you're not going to address your other issues and you're not going to get your health into line and stop your drinking or do whatever else is that you're doing that's destructive, this isn't going to fix you. It's like anything.
And I guess that's why you need a counsellor, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Someone to unpack with afterwards. So I go and I talk about these things. I go, I wonder why that came to me. I wonder what the meaning of that was. That for me, it's the largest change has been that feeling of connection that I mentioned to you before. I used to think the world is a bad place, and I was self-validated because you'd look at all the bad in the world. I find now that it's a feeling of hope and a feeling of, sort of more the rose-colored glass of view. Or, I'm not naive. Bad things happen in the world every day, but I have that belief that it can be better, and I want to be part of making it better for my kids, for the world. Where I used to want to hide away from society, I now find myself thinking, I enjoy, still an introvert, but I enjoy looking for the best in the world and hoping that I can do something that makes it a better place.
Yeah. And how has it impacted your relationship with Fee and your kids ultimately since you've been on the treatment?
So the feedback from Fee, firstly, is that I sleep far more deeply and I snore now, which she's not stoked about. But I am just
another thing to resolve.
That'll be the next counselling. I'm a happy person now. I can put my hand on my heart when people ask me and say, "How are you doing?" I don't have to say, "Oh yeah, good, busy." I say, you know what? If there was a word, I'd be content and happy. So it's like the restless energy of constantly needing to fight to get somewhere, to do something, to achieve something. Like you mentioned, those goals. Give me a list and I'll do it. I'm happy just being. And so that means I can sit and be still with the kids and just appreciate being there. With Fee, it means we can sit and talk and just be in the moment with her and be happy. I laugh spontaneously now where I never used to know what that was like. So from her reflections, I'm just a happier, more content person, which means I'm better to be around, which means, that the stress levels, that almost aura of anxiety in the house when someone is stressed and on edge has just gradually started to wind down. And it doesn't happen overnight, but it means the kids pick up off your nervous energy and your stress and your anxiety, and Fee does the same, and you bounce up off each other. But now we're all just slowly winding the anxiety and the stress down in the house, and everyone just loving life a lot more.
Yeah, it benefits everyone. Well, I guess it's not. That's what you said before, right? It's the boats rising equally, right? If you're well, you're going to lift to the people around you, and that's ultimately what it comes down to. Rob, I know we're coming up towards the 2-hour mark. We've covered a lot of ground. But I do want to offer you the opportunity, in case we haven't touched on something that you want to share or cover that I haven't asked about. So by all means.
Look, I guess maybe just two little things in closing. One would be, if anyone out there is listening, I guess the message would be, don't be afraid to want to get better and to get good. I think there is that military stoicism of, if it's, you stop it just long enough to stop the bleeding when you're injured and you get back in the game. Don't be afraid to want more, and don't be afraid to seek out the help to actually want to be happy. And don't be afraid to put yourself first and say, I do want to be content. I want to be a happy person. I don't just want to be okay. So if anyone out there, I'd recommend the program to, it's DVA endorsed and sponsored. It is all above board and legitimate. There's nothing funky about it. And then I just reflecting about something I said about the guys that I was with, calling them rabid dogs. I hope no one takes offense to that. I mean it with love.
No, of course.
And I think sometimes that people view it almost as offensive to say that our soldiers that go through those experiences are on that cusp of all having that ability to turn rogue. And I think it is, I don't say that to diminish them at all. I think the absolute counterpoint of that, which is that it speaks to the strength and the testament of those men, that there is that inner human frailty within all of us, but they had the strength and the training and the discipline not to act on it. And I think that goes for all soldiers. We are all human. We do all feel hurt. We do all suffer. And I think it's naive of us to pretend that anyone is immune to it. And instead of saying that as a bad thing, I just think it's an amazing wonder of their training and their discipline and their culture and their upbringing and everything that makes them that they carried themselves out in such an amazing way. And I'll just be forever grateful to have had the opportunity to serve with them. And it's just, that'll always be for all of us, I think, just a turning point in our lives, as it is for so many that go through something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to double click on the importance of that environment and the circumstances, right? I mean, and this is one of those points that I've picked up on the pod a number of times about those who've allegedly transgressed. We've also been not all of us, but some have been very quick to discard them as the few bad apples, who've dishonored our service or our nation. And it's very easy to say that, but without understanding the context, as you described so eloquently about the desensitization and the interplay with the environment. If we do throw them out in that manner, as I often say on the podcast, we denied them the very humanity we accused them of denying their victims. And I think that's absolutely the point you're making. To somehow think that we are immune to this, that anyone is immune to this, is naive and absolutely rejects the reality of one's lived experience under those circumstances.
And you fail. You dangerously fail to diagnose the real problem if you blame it on a few bad people and think the problem is them and everyone else is okay. We fail to diagnose the fact that what did we do to them that could have happened to all of us, and therefore how can we prevent this happening again?
Absolutely. I mean, I say it time and time again. I mean, no one is born a war criminal, and that's just a fact of life. Yes, there are those who are psychologically more prone because they have certain genetic predispositions, combinations of their personality that are more prone to, call them psychopaths or whatever, the 2 or 3% of the society, sure. But hopefully our psychological testing filters out most, if not all of those throughout the kind of enlistment process. And then the rest is up to, the upstream causes that ultimately lead down those those acts. But that's perhaps another topic for another time as well, given how much of your time I've taken. But I do want to say I'm absolutely humbled by your ability to be open, vulnerable, and to share something that's so deeply personal, and to do it in such a way that I think resonates and connects to the audience, because it is very personable and it's real. And I really want to thank you for removing the bullshit out of it, right? By speaking truthfully about your experiences, humbly where necessary, but also ruthlessly and honestly where appropriate. So I have no doubt that this episode will land well with the audience, and I certainly hope and echo everything you've said about anybody feeling like they are trapped in their own circumstances. There are ways and means out there to reach out and look for help. But on that note, mate, thank you so much. Absolutely thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, as dark as it's gone in certain places, but also landed on a very, very optimistic note. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Maz. Thank you for inviting us on. It's been an awesome conversation.
If you'd like to hear the rest of this episode and gain access to all of the episodes of The Voices of War, simply become a subscriber using the link in the show notes. As you know, I will not feature any ads on the show, which is made possible solely through the support of our subscribers. If you find value in the content, you can become one now.